It was just another ordinary day for Marcus, or so he thought. As he sat at his desk, glancing at the clock, his mind was racing. Lately, he'd been feeling a little off, like something was missing. His life had been good, or at least he had convinced himself it was. But lately, something didn't seem right. It wasn't until the phone rang that everything changed. On the other end of the line was his best friend, Jake, who had a habit of calling him when something serious was about to go down. "Marcus, you need to listen to me," Jake said, his voice filled with urgency. "I found something about Ebony. Something you need to know." Ebony. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Ebony Davis, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone. She had always been his rock, the one person he could rely on through thick and thin. But now, Jake's voice made it clear that everything was about to shatter. Jake didn't give much detail, but the gravity of his words was enough to make Marcus drop everything. He had to find out the truth, whatever it was. The whole situation felt wrong, like a piece of his life had suddenly slipped out of place. Ebony had always been open with him, or so he thought. They had been inseparable, sharing their hopes, dreams, and fears. But now, doubt was creeping into Marcus's mind, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. After the call ended, Marcus sat there in silence, his mind racing. What had Jake uncovered? What could Ebony possibly be hiding? He had to confront her, no matter what. The thought of questioning Ebony, of doubting her, made his stomach churn. But he knew it was the only way to get the truth. He couldn't keep living in this fog of uncertainty. As the evening wore on, Marcus found himself pacing in his living room, waiting for Ebony to arrive. The air felt thick with tension, each passing minute dragging on longer than the last. When the door finally opened, Marcus's heart was pounding. There she was. Ebony stood in the doorway, her radiant smile as warm as ever, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, knowing that once the conversation began, there was no turning back. "Marcus, what's wrong?" Ebony asked, her voice calm and gentle. But Marcus could see the hint of nervousness in her eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. He couldn't put it off any longer. "I know there's something you're not telling me, Ebony," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Jake told me everything." Ebony's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to get caught in her throat. The silence stretched out between them, thick and heavy. And just as she was about to say something, the doorbell rang. Who was it? And what was Ebony about to reveal? Marcus's heart skipped a beat as the doorbell rang again, louder this time, echoing through the tense silence that hung in the air. He turned to look at Ebony, whose eyes were wide with shock. She didn't move, frozen in place, as if the very sound of the doorbell had shattered the fragile calm that had settled between them. Marcus felt a surge of frustration. Why was she acting like this? What was she hiding? The doorbell rang a third time, more insistent now. "I should get it," Ebony said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. She took a few hesitant steps toward the door, but Marcus was already there, grabbing her wrist before she could reach for the handle. "Who's at the door, Ebony?" His voice was sharp, demanding an answer. She looked up at him, her face pale and her lips trembling. I don't know," she replied, though Marcus could tell she wasn't being completely honest. He had known her long enough to read the subtle shifts in her expression, the small flickers of doubt in her eyes. There was more going on than she was letting on. Marcus pulled the door open, determined to find out what was happening. Standing outside was a man Marcus had never seen before, a tall figure dressed in a dark suit, holding a briefcase in his hand. His face was serious, his eyes sharp, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to show up on someone's doorstep, especially not at this hour. "I'm sorry to intrude," the man said, his voice calm and professional. "Is this the residence of Ebony Davis?" Marcus looked at Ebony, his eyes narrowing. She stood behind him, still tense, her face pale. It was as if the stranger's presence had only made her more anxious, more closed off. Why wasn't she saying anything? "Yes, this is her home," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady but feeling a wave of unease sweep over him. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder as if to check for anyone else before stepping closer to Marcus. "My name is Thomas Clark," he said, his voice low. "I'm here on business. Is Ebony available for a conversation?" Ebony took a step forward, her hand gripping the back of Marcus's chair for support. I wasn't expecting anyone," she stammered. But Marcus could see that her hands were shaking, her nerves on edge. The man didn't seem to care much for her discomfort. "I'm afraid this is urgent," he said, his gaze shifting between the two of them. He glanced down at his briefcase and then back at Ebony. "May I come in? It's about a matter that concerns you." A chill ran down Marcus's spine. What could this man want with Ebony? What was going on? He glanced at Ebony, who seemed to be in a state of shock. She wasn't saying anything, wasn't even trying to explain. She was just standing there, caught in a whirlwind of tension and uncertainty. The silence hung thick in the air as Marcus looked back at Thomas Clark, trying to read the man's intentions. There was something off about the whole situation, something that didn't sit right with him. Why was this stranger here? What did he know about Ebony? And more importantly, why hadn't Ebony told him about this? "You don't have to let him in, Marcus," Ebony finally whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. It wasn't the defiance he expected from her. It was more like a plea, a silent cry for help. Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about a visit from a stranger. Something was wrong, and Ebony was at the center of it all. He didn't know what this man wanted, but he knew he wasn't leaving until he had answers. "I'll handle this," Marcus said firmly, stepping aside and allowing the man to enter. The tension in the room only grew, like the air itself was holding its breath. As the man stepped inside, Marcus felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He closed the door behind Thomas Clark, locking eyes with Ebony, who was still standing frozen by the entryway. She looked fragile, like a piece of glass teetering on the edge of breaking. Marcus could sense that whatever was about to unfold, it wasn't just about this stranger. This was about everything that had been left unsaid between them. And suddenly, the distance between them felt like an ocean. Clark didn't wait for an invitation. He walked past Marcus with an air of authority, as if he had done this 100 times before. Ebony seemed reluctant to follow, but she did. Marcus could see the confusion, the fear in her eyes, but also something else, something darker. This wasn't just about the man at the door. There was a history, a tangled web of lies or secrets she had kept hidden from him. And now, it was all coming to light. "I'm afraid this will be difficult for both of you," Clark said, as he sat down at the dining table without being asked. His presence in the room felt almost invasive, as if he was claiming it for his own. "But it is necessary." Marcus stood by the door, unsure whether to speak or just let the man continue. His fists clenched at his sides. Ebony was still too quiet, too distant. She wasn't even looking at him. What was she hiding? What was so important that she couldn't share it with him? He'd given her everything, his trust, his love, his loyalty. But now, he wasn't sure if he even knew her at all. Clark pulled out a folder from his briefcase, flipping it open slowly, deliberately, like he was savoring the moment. Ebony stood motionless, as if glued to the floor, her lips pressed tightly together. Her eyes flicked nervously from the man to Marcus, then back to the table. Marcus could see her trying to brace herself, to prepare for what was about to unfold. But he was terrified. What if he couldn't handle the truth? What if this shattered everything they'd built together? "Marcus, Ebony," Clark said, his voice low but firm. "You've both been living under a false assumption. Ebony, especially. What you think you know about your life. It's all been carefully constructed. And the truth? Well, the truth is far more complicated." Ebony's breath hitched. She turned to Marcus, her face pale, but this time her eyes weren't filled with the calm assurance he had always seen. They were full of fear, of guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Marcus's stomach twisted in knots. Whatever Clark was saying, whatever was coming next, it was going to change everything. Clark's eyes were fixed on Ebony now. "It's time, Ebony. You can't run from it anymore." His words were heavy, almost cruel, as though he relished the power he had over the situation. "I didn't want this," Ebony whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want you to know." Marcus felt his heart race, but he couldn't let her continue in silence. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Know what, Ebony? What are you hiding from me?" She hesitated for a moment, and Marcus could see the pain in her eyes. "It's not just about you and me, Marcus. It never was. There's more to this. More to everything." She paused, like she was searching for the right words, but there were no easy words for this. Clark spoke again, but this time his tone was colder, more calculated. "The truth is, Ebony's been involved in something far bigger than either of you realize. She's connected to a network of people who have been manipulating events, pulling strings behind the scenes." Marcus's mind spun. What did that even mean? How was Ebony involved in something like that? How could she keep all this from him? He thought he knew her better than anyone, and yet now it felt like he was standing in a room with a stranger. "Who are these people, Clark?" Marcus's voice was shaky now, his mind racing with questions. "What's all this about?" Clark leaned forward, locking eyes with Marcus. "I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you this. There are forces at play here that neither of you fully understand. And Ebony's role in it. It's bigger than you think. The choices she's made, the secrets she's kept. There's no going back from this." Ebony's face crumpled at the words. She turned away, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. It was as if the weight of her own lies was finally crushing her. But even though she looked like she was falling apart, there was still something she wasn't telling him. Something she was still hiding. Marcus's mind raced. What kind of game was this? Who was playing it? And why was Ebony involved? There were so many layers to this, so many questions with no answers. And as Clark sat back, satisfied with the tension he'd stirred up, Marcus realized one thing. The world he knew, the life he had built with Ebony, wasn't what it seemed. It was all a lie. And now, they were in too deep to back out. The air felt suffocating now. Marcus could hardly breathe. Every word that Clark spoke seemed to carve deeper into the fragile walls of his reality. And Ebony. She was still standing there, distant, her face twisted in regret. She had never looked so broken. She wasn't the woman he thought he knew. She wasn't the one who shared everything with him, the woman he trusted. Now, he didn't know what to think. His whole world felt like it was slipping out of his hands, piece by piece. Clark's gaze didn't leave them. He was watching, waiting for something, waiting for Ebony to break, or for Marcus to crack under the pressure. But Marcus wasn't about to fall apart. Not yet. There was still too much at stake. He wasn't going to let the truth slip away without a fight. "I didn't want you to be involved in this, Marcus," Ebony said, her voice barely audible. But her words didn't feel like a confession. They felt like a final plea, one last attempt to protect him from the storm that was coming. "Protect me from what?" Marcus snapped, his voice rising. "From the truth. Is that what this is about, Ebony? You've been lying to me, keeping secrets. I have the right to know. What are you mixed up in? What is all this?" His mind was in a whirlwind, spinning with questions. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like he was drowning in uncertainty. "I never asked for any of this," Ebony whispered, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I didn't want you to be part of this world. It's dangerous, Marcus. You don't understand what they're capable of." Marcus took a step closer, his voice trembling but firm. "Who, Ebony? Who are they? And why didn't you trust me enough to tell me?" His heart was racing now, every second dragging on as if time itself was standing still. He needed answers. He couldn't go on like this, not with the confusion, not with the betrayal hanging in the air. Clark suddenly stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't a discussion for the two of you. It's bigger than that. The stakes are much higher than you realize." He looked directly at Marcus. "You don't know what you're dealing with. You never will unless you're prepared to take it all the way. And by the time you understand, it might be too late." The room felt colder now. Marcus's head was spinning. Every word Clark spoke sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just about secrets or lies. It was about something far more dangerous, something he wasn't prepared for. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of this twisted puzzle. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, what was Ebony hiding? Ebony took a shaky breath, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know how to tell you, Marcus. I didn't know if I could protect you. I've done things, bad things. But it wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted it to affect you." The room seemed to close in around them. Marcus could feel the walls pressing tighter and tighter. He needed to get to the bottom of this. He couldn't keep standing in the dark, not with everything on the line. The woman he loved, was she really the person she had portrayed herself to be? Or had she been lying from the very beginning? Clark's voice broke through his thoughts. "You think you know her, Marcus, but you don't. She's been living a double life. You think your problems are just between you two, but it's not. There's a bigger game at play here. And now you're both tangled up in it." Marcus's hands clenched into fists. "What game, Clark? What are you talking about?" His voice shook with frustration. "Everything you thought you knew, about your lives, your future, it's all been manipulated. The people Ebony's involved with, the things she's done. None of this is an accident. It's been orchestrated, every single move." Marcus's mind was reeling, but something in Clark's words rang in his ears. He tried to piece it together, tried to grasp the full weight of what was being said, but it was slipping through his fingers. His eyes turned to Ebony, desperate for some kind of reassurance, but all he saw was the woman who had built her life on secrets. She looked back at him, her face full of pain. "I didn't know it would go this far, Marcus. I didn't know they would come after you." Clark stepped forward, his voice low and cold. "It's too late for you to protect him, Ebony. You should have told him sooner. The moment you let him get too close, the moment you trusted him, You made him a target. The weight of those words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He was a target. His life, his safety, everything he thought he could count on, had all been at risk because of her? The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, had kept him in the dark while playing some dangerous game. Marcus took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean, a target?" he whispered, barely able to breathe. Clark smirked, a cold, calculating look in his eyes. "You'll find out soon enough. But by the time you do, it might be too late for both of you." The room went silent. The tension was unbearable. Marcus didn't know what to believe anymore, and Ebony's silence wasn't helping. Every question he asked seemed to bring more confusion, more danger. The only thing he knew for sure was that whatever was coming, it was bigger than either of them. And it was coming for them both. The silence hung thick in the air, suffocating everything around them. Marcus could feel his heartbeat in his throat, his pulse thundering in his ears. Every second that passed only seemed to deepen the dread creeping up his spine. He had to know more. He needed answers, real answers. But as the tension grew, something unexpected happened. The doorbell rang again, this time even more urgently than before. Marcus turned sharply, his body instinctively tensing. He didn't know if he could handle any more interruptions, not with the storm that was already swirling in the room. His eyes darted to Ebony, who was standing still, her face pale and filled with something unfamiliar. Fear, guilt, maybe both. But whatever it was, it made her look like a stranger. "I'll get it," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. He needed to break the tension, to do something. He moved toward the door, barely glancing at Clark, who remained sitting with a smug expression on his face. As Marcus reached for the door, his mind was reeling. How could everything feel so wrong? How could Ebony be so involved in something he couldn't even begin to understand? His hands gripped the doorknob, and just as he was about to open it, the door swung open on its own. Standing in the doorway was another man, taller than Clark, dressed in dark tactical gear. He had the look of someone who didn't care much for pleasantries. His expression was stone cold, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of someone trained for situations like this. He didn't even look at Marcus. His eyes went straight to Ebony. "You're coming with us," the man said, his voice harsh, clipped and commanding. Marcus's chest tightened. "What the hell is this?" he spat, stepping in front of Ebony instinctively, his protective instincts kicking in. He had no idea who this man was, but he wasn't going to let him take Ebony without a fight. "I said," the man repeated, his tone sharper now, "you're coming with us." Clark stood up slowly, his smirk widening. "I told you, Marcus. It's too late for you to stop this. You're both too deep in it now. And there's no way out." Marcus felt his blood run cold. He turned toward Ebony, his voice desperate. "Ebony, what is this? Who are these people? What do they want with you?" But Ebony didn't answer. She didn't move, didn't say a word. She just stood there, her face stricken with the kind of fear Marcus had never seen in her eyes before. It was as if she had been caught in something far beyond her control. The more Marcus stared at her, the more it seemed like she wasn't the person he thought she was. "You're not taking her anywhere," Marcus growled, standing his ground. His fists were clenched at his sides, adrenaline starting to pulse through his veins. He had no idea who this man was, or why they were after Ebony, but he wouldn't let her go. The man's gaze flicked from Marcus to Ebony, as if sizing up the situation. "You don't have a choice. She's already made her decision." With that, the man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, pressing a button. The room was suddenly flooded with a sharp, high-pitched sound, the kind that made Marcus's ears ring. He flinched, instinctively putting his hands over his ears, but the noise only seemed to intensify. And then it happened. Ebony's body went rigid. She froze in place, her eyes wide, her lips parted, but she didn't speak. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a random attack. It was calculated. The man stepped forward, and in a swift motion, he grabbed Ebony by the arm, pulling her toward the door. "No!" Marcus shouted, rushing forward to stop him. But the man was too fast, too strong. Before Marcus could even lay a hand on him, the man turned to face him. "Stay out of this, Marcus. It's over." And just like that, Marcus's world turned upside down. He reached out, but the man yanked Ebony out of the doorway, dragging her away from him. It happened so quickly, Marcus couldn't even process what was happening. He heard her gasp, her voice barely a whisper, "I'm sorry, Marcus." And then she was gone. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway. His mind was a blur. It felt like everything was spinning out of control. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This wasn't supposed to happen. He didn't know who these people were, or what they had done to her, but they had taken her. In that moment, everything he thought he knew, about Ebony, about their life together, was shattered. The woman he loved had been lying to him all along. And now, they had her. A part of him wanted to give up, to let the confusion consume him. But another part of him, the part that had always trusted Ebony, the part that still believed in her, refused to accept this. He wasn't going to lose her, not without a fight. But just as he turned to look at Clark, ready to demand answers, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Clark wasn't smiling anymore. In fact, he looked almost worried. "Marcus, you have no idea what's coming," Clark said, his voice suddenly serious. "This is bigger than you think. The people who have Ebony. They won't stop until they have you too." Marcus's stomach dropped. The stakes had just gotten higher, much higher. And now, everything was about to get far worse before it got any better. Marcus's mind was racing. Everything had spiraled so quickly, and now, with Ebony gone, he was left standing in the cold silence of the hallway. Clark's words echoed in his head. The people who had taken her. They wouldn't stop until they had him too. But why? Why was he caught up in all of this? What had Ebony gotten herself involved in? And why had she kept him in the dark? For a brief moment, all Marcus could feel was rage. Righteous, burning rage. He wanted answers. He needed them, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. His thoughts were a blur as he turned toward Clark, whose expression had shifted from smugness to something more calculating. "You've played your part, Marcus. But it's over now," Clark said, his voice almost pitying, as if Marcus were nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. Marcus lunged forward, grabbing Clark by the collar. "Where is she?" His voice was a low growl, filled with raw desperation. "What do you want with her?" Clark didn't flinch. Instead, he looked down at Marcus's hands, still gripping his shirt, and then back into his eyes. "You still don't get it, do you? It's not about what I want. It's about what she's done." His voice dropped lower, darker. "And it's about what you're about to become." Marcus's grip tightened, but before he could say anything else, the sound of a phone ringing shattered the tension. Clark reached into his pocket, his expression never changing as he answered the call. Marcus didn't care about the conversation. He was too focused on one thing, finding Ebony. Clark finished the call and slowly hung up, his face darkening. "You want to know where she is?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "She's where you never should have let her go. You've been too blind to see it, Marcus. Too trusting." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Clark turned to face him, his eyes cold, calculating. "Ebony's been working with them all along. She's not the woman you thought she was. She's been playing you, Marcus. Every step of the way." Marcus staggered back, disbelief seizing him. "No, that's not true. She wouldn't." Clark cut him off, his tone flat and final. "She would. She has. She's been feeding information to them, manipulating you into this position, using you as a pawn. She's been involved with this operation from the start." Marcus's head spun. He felt like the ground was falling away beneath him. How could she do this? How could the woman he loved be part of something so dark, so dangerous? His chest tightened as the weight of the truth sank in. "You're lying," Marcus said, the words feeling hollow in his mouth. But Clark's icy gaze told him otherwise. "I'm not," Clark said with finality. "It was all part of the plan. She was always meant to get close to you, to make you trust her. And now you're both caught in the crossfire." A sickening feeling twisted in Marcus's stomach. If Ebony had been part of this all along, what did that mean for him? And if she hadn't been the person he thought she was? Was any of it real? Before Marcus could process this devastating revelation, Clark stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "And you're next." Without warning, Clark grabbed Marcus by the arm, pulling him toward the door. "We're going to the place where all of this started. It's the only way to end it." Marcus's thoughts were a jumbled mess, but he couldn't just give up now. He couldn't let this be the end. He had to find Ebony, had to confront her to understand the truth. But just as he was about to protest, the door burst open again. Standing in the doorway was Ebony. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood two men, dressed in the same tactical gear as the one who had taken her earlier. Their eyes were cold, their weapons at the ready. And Ebony. She wasn't the same woman Marcus had known. Her eyes were cold too, distant, like she had already crossed a line she couldn't uncross. "Marcus," Ebony said, her voice hollow, like the words had been rehearsed. "I'm sorry." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The shock of seeing her again, of seeing her standing there with them, fully involved, sent a cold shiver down his spine. "You were right, Marcus," Ebony continued, her voice low but unwavering. "I've been lying to you, and I've been lying to myself. But now it's too late to turn back." Marcus felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He wanted to reach out to her, to shake her, to make her snap out of whatever trance she was in. But he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. And just as Marcus tried to make sense of it all, something in the corner of the room caught his eye. A small, hidden camera. It had been there the entire time. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. This whole thing, the secrets, the lies, the danger, had been filmed. Every move, every conversation, every moment of doubt. Marcus wasn't the only one being manipulated. They all were. And the people pulling the strings weren't just after him. They had been watching every step of their lives. Clark's voice broke through the fog in Marcus's mind. "I told you. This was never about you and Ebony. You were just part of something much bigger." Ebony stepped forward, her face unreadable. "I never wanted it to be like this, Marcus. But I couldn't stop it. And now, neither can you." The room seemed to spin as Marcus realized the truth. It wasn't just his life that had been manipulated. It was all of theirs. And the final twist? It had all been recorded for someone else's gain. The game had changed, and now there was no way out. The truth crashed down on Marcus like a tidal wave, leaving him gasping for air, struggling to keep his balance. Everything he had believed about Ebony, about the life they had built together, had been shattered. She wasn't the woman he thought she was. She had been playing him, and all the while, he had been too blind to see it. The camera in the corner of the room was a cruel reminder that nothing had been real. Not their love, not their connection, not even their time together. Ebony stood there, her expression unreadable. Her silence was worse than any confession. She had betrayed him. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that she wasn't the only one at fault. He had been a pawn in a game far bigger than either of them. And the people pulling the strings? They had been watching every step of the way, waiting for the right moment to make their move. As the realization set in, Marcus felt a strange calm wash over him. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It wasn't even about Ebony. This was about survival, about taking control back, no matter the cost. He looked at her, his voice steady. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me?" Ebony's eyes filled with regret, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing second. Clark, who had been standing silently by the door, finally spoke up. "It's too late to fix things, Marcus. But maybe you'll understand in time. You were never supposed to know. You were never supposed to be this involved." Marcus's fists clenched, but he didn't move. The time for fighting was over. He had to accept that the life he knew was gone, but maybe, just maybe, he could still find a way out. "Then why are you still here, Clark? What's your end game?" Marcus's voice was low, but there was a fire behind it now. He wasn't going to let them control him any longer. Clark didn't answer right away. He simply watched Marcus, sizing him up, as if evaluating whether he still posed a threat. "It's not about control, Marcus. It's about the game. And now, you're a part of it." He turned to Ebony, nodding once. "Take him to the van. It's time for him to face the consequences of his choices." The men who had been standing in the doorway began to move, but Marcus was ready. He had no more answers, but he had one thing left, his own will. As they closed in on him, he made a snap decision. He wouldn't go down without a fight, not like this. He turned quickly, knocking over the small table in the room and causing a commotion. It was enough to break the careful balance, enough to shift the power dynamic, even if only for a moment. The men hesitated, just long enough for Marcus to make his move. He bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. He couldn't go back to the way things were, not after everything that had happened, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to escape this mess. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let them win. As he pushed through the door, the cold night air hit him like a slap in the face. He didn't know where to go or who to trust, but he knew he couldn't stay here. Behind him, the sound of footsteps followed, but he didn't look back. He just ran. Ebony watched him go, standing there in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She had made her choices, but so had Marcus. In the end, they were both trapped in a web of lies, and now, neither of them could escape. As Marcus disappeared into the night, leaving the life he once knew behind, he realized something. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. But in this new world of secrets and betrayals, there was one thing Marcus knew for sure. Survival meant never trusting anyone completely. Not even himself.